I can't actually see the whole room. So Daniel and Nikhil, does that look like a number of people that we're supposed to have?
Yep, I think that's looking right.
Okay, excellent. Then let's get started. So my name's Kira. Yeah, I'm a senior up at Ingraham. And I'm going to be talking today about tiny houses and homelessness in Seattle and what we're doing about it. What we're doing about homelessness, particularly with tiny houses. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or just unmute and like interrupt me. That's fine. And I will also ask for questions at the end before we get to our little discussion things. Sound good? Cool beans. Okay. So in Seattle, like right now, there are more than 10,000 homeless people, which is obviously a huge problem for a multitude of reasons, but most importantly, those people's quality of life is suffering, and that's terrible. There are many reasons for their situation, from the astronomical cost of living in our beautiful city, to job loss, to addiction, to whatever. The point is they need help to get out of this situation. It's incredibly difficult to get off the streets while not having any support systems. So what are we doing about it? The city has tried some direct action, but the city-run shelters and the city-run programs tend to come up short, and they tend to struggle with efficiency and struggle with having too much bureaucracy, and that eats up a lot of the funding because they're paying people to like oversee the whatever instead of like paying for the services, right? So what the city has sort of transitioned to is helping to fund a lot of nonprofit organizations, which includes food banks and shelters, as well as the Low Income Housing Institute, LIHI, which is the organization that we're going to be focusing on today because they do some really interesting work. Yeah. So the Low Income Housing Institute is one of the many organizations fighting homelessness in Seattle. They focus on tiny house villages and urban rest stops. And the concept of an urban rest stop is sort of interesting. It's like a free laundromat, and you can take showers, and you have access to running water, and like all sorts of like things that homeless people might not have access to, that are like helping them get their life together, right? So things like having access to laundry is really helpful if you need to go get a job interview or whatever. Like you're trying to get out of this, but if you don't have clean clothes, then a job interview is going to be really hard, right? And LIHI's other main focus is using funding as efficiently as possible to actually help people's lives get better. And their tiny house villages have been shown to be the most effective solution for getting people off the streets long term. So people tend to go into their tiny house villages and then leave them to permanent housing, as opposed to going into, say, a shelter, and just when they leave the shelter, they're just ending up back on the streets, as opposed like rather than in permanent housing, which obviously is great that they're having a success getting people off the streets permanently. So LIHI's model is one of the really unique things that LIHI does is that they cut costs on their tiny houses in part by working with job training programs to provide materials in exchange for the program building the houses as part of their curriculum. So it allows for, they're just paying for the materials instead of paying like experienced carpenters to do things, but the quality of the work is the same because it's being checked over by the instructor, but the labor is free, and that's fine because they're getting an education out of it, right? They're learning how to build these things. And so it's good for everyone because the job training programs don't have to pay for the materials, and LIHI doesn't have to pay for the labor, right? So that's a win-win for everyone. And the other really interesting thing about this is that because the tiny houses, you can pick them up and move them on a truck, and they're reusable time and time again, it's a flat one-time fee of $4,000, $4,500 to build a tiny house and then use it for years to come, right? So they're not just worried about current It's not this bed costs, you know, $300 a month or whatever to build, or to maintain. It's, we're building this thing. They may pay some minor rent to the city for the land they're using, but they're not paying rent on a space. They're not like, there's not as much maintenance cost. There's a lot more upfront cost, which makes it a little easier to maintain these sorts of things for longer. If that makes sense. Yeah. And as I talked about, they're supporting the job training programs, and the job training programs are supporting them, right? And so that also is a great opportunity for the students, which sort of brings me to my next thing, the Seattle Skill Center, who works with LIHI a lot, and that's the program that I'm a part of. It's an Seattle Public Schools job training program that does, they do firefighting and nursing and auto tech and a bunch of other programs, as well as carpentry. But carpentry is one of the ones that's really popular and that they work with LIHI on, because it allows high school students to basically have a jumping off point, where from there it's super easy to get an apprenticeship in the trades, which is schooling that you're getting paid to do, right? So you show up at the job site every day and you're getting paid, you know, 18 to 20 bucks an hour to just be there and learn. And like, you're doing work, you know, you're there to work, but you're also getting paid to be there, which is super, which is a huge contrast to college, where you're likely to end up in debt. As an apprentice, you are likely to not end up in debt, and you are likely to like just never end up with student loans, which in my opinion is fantastic. And especially for lower income students who don't necessarily have the means to stay out of debt, that's a great option, because they're careers that we need people for. Anyway, so the Skill Center is great. I've really enjoyed my time there. If you're at Ingraham, check it out. That's my plug for Skill Center. So LIHI's tiny house villages are single room tiny houses. They have another kind of thing that they call it cottages that we'll get to in a second. But they're single room tiny houses. They have locking doors, which is super important, because a lot of times at shelters, there isn't actually a place for you to lock stuff up. It's just, you have a bed and you're in a room with a bunch of other people with a bed, right? So having a place where you can lock stuff away so you can leave it there while you go do other things is super important. And that's one of the really important things about housing. They're recommended for one occupant, but they aren't limited in terms of whether or not you can have pets in them, which is another issue that shelters face, where the shelters reasonably are like, I don't want, like, we don't want people's pets here. But there are a lot of homeless folks whose only companions are their pets, and they don't want to like give their pet up, because they'd rather sleep on the streets than give their pet up and sleep in a shelter. And they also have access to regularly clean porta potties, running water, and showers, all of which is super important, because people need clean water and sanitation facilities, and it helps keep everything clean and together, right? And trash services, that's another thing that I forgot to put on there. But like trash collection services are also huge. They're located throughout the city. I think there are like 5 or 10 locations right now. And they're largely just like vacant parking lots that they put a fence up around and put tiny houses on, which is pretty cool. Yeah, that's where that stands. So these are a couple of tiny houses that we made up at Ingraham last year. Whoop, I clicked. Apparently that's not allowed. And as you can see, they're not big. They're like 8 by 12 or something like that. But they're large enough to sleep in, and they're definitely livable, but they're not huge. And you can this next picture, you can sort of see how there's a lot, like you can fit them pretty close together. and fit a lot of people on not very much space, which is great in terms of high density housing for not using a ton of space, but being able to house a bunch of people, which is excellent. And then there's the cottage village, which is, there's one going in at Magnuson Park, and COVID has sort of slowed down their installation. I think they were trying to get them all in over the summer, but then that didn't happen because of COVID. But there are more to come as the world returns to normal. So they're designed for small families, which is, again, another shortfall of shelters, where often the shelters are looking for one person. They're not looking for families. And it's hard to find a shelter that will take your whole family of 4 or whatever. And obviously, families are one of the groups that really would like to be off the streets as soon as possible. And it's really dangerous for kids to be growing up homeless. But they're designed for families, and they're more like a little tiny they're more like a little tiny house. That's very helpful. But they're more self-contained. They have a loft, an individual bathroom, and running water, like a flush toilet. And they have a separate, they have a bedroom. They have multiple rooms, and they have more amenities, I guess, that would make it easier to have more people in them. And that's what we're currently building at Ingraham this year. Yeah, that's all my stuff. And these are a couple of things we're working on. These are pieces of the loft. It comes in 3 pieces. There's the chassis, which is the main floor, the loft, which stacks on top of it, and the bedroom bump out, which is just a bump out the side, right? So this is the loft, and you can see it's pretty short, but we're putting it together, and LIHI will show up with a truck and cart it off to Magnuson to put it all together, which is super cool. Hopefully by the end of the year, we'll get that done. And then these are some other, this is the bedroom bump out here on the left, and the chassis on the right. And so that's sort of where those stand in terms of, where was I going with that? That's how you can sort of see how big those are comparatively to the tiny houses that we were looking at earlier that are much smaller and definitely just one room. These are definitely have more space for an actual family to have an actual house. Did I move? I moved the map to down here. Okay. And you can sort of see that they're going to go in a more permanent way than the tiny houses. They're not going to be as mobile. And they're going to have a play area and a community garden, and it's going to be much more like a standard affordable housing development, where they, which they also have some of in Magnuson that I think are run by LIHI. I don't know for sure though. But they're going in much more permanently, and they're going to have more amenities there as a more transitional housing as opposed to emergency housing. Yeah. So that's where that stands. Any questions so far? Feel free to put them in the chat or whatever. Okay, cool. And then we have, so one of the things that I know this conference is talking about is the UN goals for sustainability. And where a lot of LIHI's work ties into that is with clean water, getting people access to water, because we're really lucky here in Seattle to have great municipal water, but you have to be able to access the municipal water for that to help you at all, right? Because either you're drinking bottled water, which is expensive for whoever's paying for it, or you don't have access to clean water. And both of those are rough for many reasons. And there's also providing housing to people, obviously, and ending poverty is one of the UN's goals, but and that's also what LIHI's working towards, of ending, getting people off the streets, which is one of the most current forms of ending poverty that we need to work on. And obviously there are people living in poverty who aren't living on the streets, but we can start with homeless people and then move our way up. And then reducing inequalities overall is super important. And that's one of the things that LIHI is working on. And then I believe I have some discussion questions for your discussion pleasure. So what other kinds of nonprofit work could be benefited by LIHI's model of working with job training programs in whatever format? And how could other homelessness prevention agencies work with or around LIHI's work? And that's sort of over to y'all. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is like slightly different from that. But like LIHI also has like a big warehouse down in like South Seattle where you can go and volunteer to like paint carpentry as well. Yeah, that's a little aside.
Yeah, that's I think they have, they build some of them in-house. I've heard about that.
I've like painted stuff there a couple of times. It's a fun time. But I think LIHI's model is awesome, especially sort of how they're taking an opportunity with like the manufacturing of their product to like give back to the community and like engage the community in the process of that as well. So I think that's like applicable to like other things as well. Like we were talking about public health and the keynotes earlier. And then like a big thing, like so a similar model to that, like the transferability of that model would be instead of maybe in like just sending doctors over to like say India, they're in crisis right now. Like actually like sending doctors over, not just to help in the short term, but like to train people long term, like while they're helping over there. Is I guess like making while you're doing the thing, making like investments in the long term for the community by engaging them. Because I guess I saw like the transferability of LIHI's model.
Well, and that's sort of that cliche of you teach a man to, or you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, you teach him to fish, you feed him for his lifetime, or however that is supposed to go. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Did you say homeless people are doing the work to build the tiny houses themselves occasionally?
No, it's so it's other people in the job training programs. And you can go into the job training programs as a homeless person, but it's not like they're taking people off the streets and being like, hey, you're gonna build yourself a house today. Which hopefully they can get more people who need job training into those programs. That would be excellent. But that's not where it's at yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I have a question. Like, for example, do you receive like volunteers, or is it just like your group that are creating the campaign, or do you like recruit other people?
So we have worked with some volunteer like professional carpenters who are volunteering. Well, there are a couple of companies that we've worked with, but it's mostly people who are taking because it's a class at Ingraham. The skill center construction trades class is a class that you take, and then through that you get it's a woodshop class, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so we are volunteering somewhat, but not just volunteering. Somebody put something in the chat. Nicholas, there are over 10,000. The most recent number I saw was something like 15,000, but I also don't know when that number was taken, and that's why I underestimated, because I don't want to give you misinformation. Yeah. And that's just in Seattle. I don't know about other metropolis cities. Yeah.
And I have another question. Do you think that this program could work for making sure that, you know, a very large amount of people who are homeless finally get homes and job training and all of the benefits that this program offers? Do you think it could be nearly like 100% of homeless people, or do you think that's too much? Do you think it's going to, in the long term, be able to help most or many, but not all? Or how do you see that in the future?
I really hope that that we can get houses like tiny houses for, you know, every homeless person in Seattle or every homeless person period. That would be great. And LIHI's response overall, like the response they've been getting from people who they're like, hey, we have tiny houses, do you want to come live in them? The answer is pretty much always yes, because there aren't as many strings attached as there are at a shelter, right? And there are more. I don't know if the job training aspect would work for everyone, depending on the depending on if they're struggling with a disability or, you know, what's going on there. That might not be super applicable to everyone, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be offered to everyone, if you know what I mean. So that's sort of where I hope to see it in the future, is getting people at least offered that job training and definitely the housing offered to everyone.
I'm sorry.
Go for it.
I have a question. So I was just looking at some quick numbers. So apparently each year Seattle spends about $7,000 per homeless person by the city of Seattle itself. So I guess I'm wondering, like, where is it going? Because I mean, they could have $5,000 left over after building a tiny home for every single homeless person. Seems
so
like
that tends to go into welfare systems like food banks and shelters that, like I said, are more expensive to run, right? Because the reality is, even if you give every person every homeless person a house, they're still not necessarily going to be every homeless person can feed themselves. And so there's a lot of stuff there with food banks and with other charitable organizations that are happening there. And like social security net, whatever. So some of that is unavoidable, but also I think it was Montreal, somewhere in Canada, did an experiment where they gave every homeless person like $7,000 or something, and their homelessness rate dropped. Like it was like dropped by like 70% or something. Don't quote me on these numbers. I read this and then I promptly forgot. But it was a huge drop in their homeless population, because people suddenly had the resources, right, to go and get permanent housing and whatever and figure out a job. So yes, you can figure out, like yes, there is a lot of money going per homeless person, but a lot of that is also just like keeping people from dying and like hospital costs and whatever that looks like. Does that make sense?
yeah, thanks.
I saw something in the chat and then my chat icon went away and I don't know how to get it back. Aha! Okay, here we go. It also goes to police sweeps, Ellie, yes, and negative things that the city is doing that is not ideal. So, yeah. Should they need to pay an amount to live there or stay there? They, in my opinion, no. Especially if they don't have the resources to do that, like if they don't have a job, then why should they? You know, the whole point is to get people housed who can't afford housing. So it doesn't seem like it's super helpful to throw a rent charge on top of that. And I do know that LIHI does do some stuff that is transitional housing that does have rent, but it's rent controlled, so it's much lower rent, and it's as affordable as they can make it, right? It comes out to more like utilities that you're paying. So there is, LIHI does do some stuff that is rent based, but it's mostly not. That's where that stands.
I have a question. I don't know if you mentioned this before. In case you, I'm sorry, it's just
no worries.
Okay, so the highest problem, does it only like include, you know, like free housing for these homeless people, or like does the program gives like, how to say, like, okay, like access to food in case they don't have, I mean, like in case they can't pay it, or like some free healthcare in some way, you know, just not like everything, but you know, if they have access to healthcare in there.
I think LIHI tries to set up their sites near food banks. I don't think LIHI themselves does food bank stuff, just because of because they focus on housing. But I think they try and locate near food banks and other like food assistance stuff. And I'm pretty sure that they have stuff in place to try and get people onto Medicare and Medicaid as they qualify, which again isn't perfect in any way, but it helps. And especially if you're super low income, then they probably do qualify.
Right, and also another thing, like, okay, so the homeless person has to, you know, do they have to have like some requirements in order to get a house, or I mean, does the program just like gives homes to every homeless person that, you know, they can?
So there's an application process. I don't know entirely what that entails. I know they have had some that are like drug-free, right? Like they're not welcoming people who are using in an effort to help people, right? But they're also not necessarily like there aren't the same kind of requirements that there are on a lot of the homeless shelters. So you know, you can bring your pets, and you can, like, there's not a ton of requirements. It's not like you have to have been homeless for 3 years to qualify or something like that, right? It's more just we want to house as many people as we can.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
And how could the common volunteer in Seattle get involved with LIHI?
So they run, I think Ronan mentioned this, they run volunteer clinics, or clinics, they're not clinics. They run volunteer sessions out of their warehouses. I think that there are volunteer positions in terms of like maintaining the tiny house communities. There's also, you can also go, if you are at Ingraham or Rainier Beach, I think is the other high school that does this, you can join the construction trades class and build the houses. You can donate. If you go to LIHI's website, I'm pretty sure there's a volunteer tab. I can check that in a second when I stop sharing my screen, and put that link in the chat. Does that answer your question, Ellie? Perfect. Andrea asks, how do you get the resources to create these houses? Is it based on donations from different organizations, or do you create the profit to build these houses? So we, there's donations from like individual donors and like organizations and whatever. There's also funding from the city that gets put into LIHI. LIHI works pretty closely with the city, and that's how they get access to parks and stuff to build tiny house communities. I think there are some, like, sometimes I know Ingraham has considered putting in a thing to our PTA of like, hey, could you donate however much money so we can build three tiny houses, or however much that amounts to, right? But LIHI, from what I know, isn't super struggling with funds. they're mostly struggling right now with having places to build stuff that aren't closed for COVID. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Andrea?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Perfect. Of course.
Do you know where the human waste is disposed, or if it's harmful, like for the environment where it is disposed of?
I don't know. I know that they're in their tiny house communities. I believe they're largely using porta potties, which I don't know what they do with the porta potty stuff, but I know they're not disposing of it on site. I imagine they're following the or I'm sure they're following the city like guidelines on where to dispose of that. So I can't imagine that it's like they're just dumping it someplace. And I would bet that it's a lot better than people not having access to bathroom facilities at all, which has been sort of an issue in places with a lot of homeless people here in Seattle. And then I know that some of the cottages that are going in will have indoor plumbing and all of that, so that you can so that that's just going into the sewer system, same as a standard house. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Fabiana, am I saying that right? I hope so. Feel free to correct me. Excellent. Do you need to be in Seattle to help build the houses? For LIHI, yes. But there are a lot of places around the or at least to help like physically build the houses. If you want to donate, that's great, and you can do that from anywhere. But there are also probably organizations closer to home. There are organizations closer to home in most places that you can also work with and donate to. I agree with you, Ellie. Building more permanent public bathrooms would benefit everyone, but that's also expensive, and so they're working around that. Ronan, I thought we had until 11:45, but if we want to start wrapping up now, that's.
Oh, I'm sorry. I actually checked the schedule again. Yeah, we actually have some more. We
Okay.
have 5-10 more minutes.
Okay. Cool. Any last questions in the last few minutes or comments?
Yeah, where do you guys, or like the the program gets their income? Like, is it through donations, or do you guys have like sponsors or something?
So LIHI or the Skill Center program?
LIHI, sorry.
Yeah, no. So they have some like state and city funding. They get a lot of donations from people like philanthropists and concerned citizens and whatever. I don't think they do a ton of like a super aggressive fundraising, but they do they work with the city and the state and donors, and they have some sponsors. Nikhil, so the ones that are at Magnuson Park are permanent, or at least like 10-15 years kind of permanent, as permanent as any structure is. So those cottages are going in permanently. The tiny houses move around and aren't on foundations. They're just like set and leveled, like set down and leveled. So it depends on what kinds. But the Magnuson ones are being constructed where there's already affordable housing there. I don't know if you've been to Magnuson Park, but it's a former military base, and they turned a bunch of the officers' quarters and barracks into affordable housing. And that's where they're going, if that makes sense. I'm not getting any feedback, so I'm going to assume that makes sense. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions? We're starting to get to the time where I'd be okay with wrapping up, but I'm also happy to stick around and answer questions if there are more. I'm not hearing anything. Feel free to throw something in the chat. Go ahead.
I just have one more. Okay, so when when the homeless person goes into a house and I don't know, let's say they get a job and they get like their life back in track and they already have like income so they can assist themselves and everything. Do you guys require them to leave the house or can they stay in the house?
So my understanding of the tiny houses are that they aren't required to leave. They are encouraged to leave, and they're not like they're better than sleeping in a tent in that they're like insulated and have a roof that doesn't leak, and have electricity. But they're not like as good as an apartment would be, or like another housing, like a permanent housing situation. And so I don't think they really need to throw people out, because once they have the means to go and like actually live in an apartment or a house or whatever, they tend to do that because it's just a better living situation, right? All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And yeah, any other questions before we wrap up? All right, I'm not seeing anything. Feel free to throw it in chat. I'll be hanging out for a couple minutes as you guys leave, but I think that's all I have. So
yeah, and before everyone heads out, I think we are going to want to get one group picture as well. So if you're comfortable, please turn on your video in the next few seconds, and I'll give you guys a countdown before we go ahead and take a group photo for this group sort of thing. All right, awesome. Seeing a lot of faces, so we'll go ahead and give us a countdown. Let's see. 3, 2, 1, smile. All right, there we go. I think we got it. Yeah, if you want to mention anything else.
I'm all set. If you have any questions, feel free to send them my way, though.
Thank you, Kira.
Yeah, thanks for coming. It was a good time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wait, should we leave the meeting? Or
Yeah, you're welcome to.
Okay.
If you have questions, you can stick around, but. Ivy, there is, so I think it depends on the kind of work you're doing. If you're working through a job training center, then you're just subject to their age requirement, which some of those are 16 and some of those are 18. It depends on where you are. And some of those are like 12. Like it really just depends. But for volunteering with LIHI proper, I think they require their volunteers to be either 16 or 18. I don't remember which. But some of that's just because they're working, like they can be working in more dangerous situations and they don't want to subject minors to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I'm sorry that I connected kind of kind of late because I don't know why my insurance has been like really bad this day for some reason. So I kind of missed the first part. So LIHI kind of like a program like itself, or do you guys have a program to like educate people on how to work on LIHI and then you send them?
So LIHI works with job training programs, and we're not going to work for LIHI. we're going to work, like we have the skills to go and get a carpentry apprenticeship or an electrician's apprenticeship or whatever, right? So they're sort of two separate things, but they work together to build the houses, right? So the program that I work with is through Seattle Public Schools, that I'm a part of is through Seattle Public Schools, but they also work with local community colleges and all kinds of other job training programs, if that makes sense.
Okay, so you guys are like job programs and you don't work for LIHI, you work for the program that, you know.
Yeah, so you leave the program with a certificate, and when you leave, you're not tied to LIHI, but the when you're there, you're building stuff for LIHI to then take and use, right? And LIHI provides the materials. So it kind of works out.
And do you think that LIHI is kind of like open to working in other countries, or is it just, you know, is it just like Seattle based?
So LIHI is super happy to like share their materials and their resources with organizations in other parts of the world or other cities.
Yeah.
But they're not they're not interested in expanding personally. Like they're not going to like make more LIHI branches with under the Seattle leadership, because they just don't have resources to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And so like, okay, but like maybe, I don't know, do you think that there's like a chance to, you know, like get to know LIHI and they like kind of explain their program to you, so maybe you can implement it in another place?
Yeah, I think that would be doable. If I were you, I would reach out to LIHI. I can pull up their outreach email. One second. LIHI Seattle. And I just can't spell. Okay, neat. Here we are. So here, let me put the link to their let me put the link to their thingy to their website in the chat. And I'm sure that if you reached out and were like, hey, I'm interested in starting a, you know, low income housing based thing, you know, wherever you are, they would be super happy to work with you and figure out what they can do to help. But because they have limited funding, it's really hard for them to move outside of Seattle, right?
Oh yeah, no, I can't imagine, like, I don't think they can support, you know, like every free housing, but yeah, it's just that I think, you know, like how to say it, like their, you know, like their main objective is kind of nice, and the way that they work is really interesting. So I'm, you know, open to just learning how they do it and maybe implement it somewhere else, maybe like more in my community kind of. So,
yeah, that would be super cool. And if you're really committed, I know that the Skill Center does do summer programs, and you could probably theoretically like try and do an exchange summer, but like that's kind of a lot. I don't know like how committed you are.
No, but I totally understand. No, actually, thank you very much. It was like really, thank you for your time.
Of course. Thanks for being engaged. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.